Good morning, and thank you all very much for being here today. Today's hearing will focus on the aftermath of the landmark Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, both within the Bush administration and within Congress. In 1998, in response to an inquiry by then Representative Tom DeLay, the Clinton administration's Environmental Protection Agency said that it believed that the Clean Air Act provided it with the authority to regulate carbon dioxide. 1 year later, a group of environmental and other advocacy organizations petitioned the EPA to use this authority to set greenhouse gas standards for cars. But it wasn't until 2003, when the Bush administration had already embarked on a course of denial, delay, and dismissal of the risks of climate change and the need to address it, that the EPA repudiated the Clinton administration's conclusion that carbon dioxide was a pollutant that could be regulated and denied the petition. That petition became the case known as Massachusetts versus EPA. Until April of this year, the Bush administration continued to assert that it lacked authority to regulate carbon dioxide. It continued to assert that the science was uncertain, that voluntary programs to reduce emissions would be sufficient, and that rhetorical policy goals should take the place of binding regulatory language. It continued to fight the states who were pushing to move ahead. But all that changed when the Supreme Court ruled that under the plain meaning of the Clean Air Act, carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and that EPA could not hide behind its smokescreen any longer. In fact, under the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Clean Air Act, EPA now has the duty to regulate as long as it determines that emissions of carbon dioxide endanger public health and welfare. Nevertheless, the President has issued a new executive order that effectively said, start studying this problem and try to finish it up right before I leave office. 6.5 years into his administration, after the scientific consensus on the dangers of climate change has become overwhelming, after we hear that the Earth has warmed so much that transportation routes in Greenland that used to require dog sleds in the winter now can be traveled by boat, the President sees no urgency and is engaged in a stall. Instead of moving to regulate against the threat of global warming, he has decided that his cabinet is to spend the remainder of his term talking about it. And the signs that this issue isn't being taken seriously enough by this administration doesn't end there. Just last week, the head of NASA said that he wasn't sure if global warming was a problem that we needed to wrestle with. At this week's G8 meeting, the President indicated that all he is willing to do is engage in fruitless discussions on the nature of non-binding goals until the very end of his administration, leaving his successor with the task of actually doing something. I hope that our executive branch witnesses will be able to shed some light on the nature and stringency of the proposal they are working on. But as the EPA and NHTSA lace up their shoes and start to head over to the starting blocks, 12 states are already sprinting to the finish line as they have already promulgated regulations that reduce emissions from cars. They have already concluded that the science is unequivocal. The risk is real, and the solutions within our grasp. Under the circumstances, it would be helpful to the planet if our regulatory agencies would simply stop being obstacles to other actors. If EPA would grant California's request to act, other states could act as well. I hope that Mr. Johnson will be able to shed some light on the schedule for the approval process. I expect some of our witnesses have also taken note of the emergence of a legislative attempt to block EPA from acting. The discussion draft pending in the Energy and Commerce Committee, for example, would have the effect of overturning Massachusetts versus EPA. Specifically, that legislation would remove EPA's authority to set greenhouse gas standards for cars and preempt states' rights by requiring EPA to deny California's request to move forward with its own greenhouse gas program. In its place, that bill proposes anemic fuel economy standards and opens the door to allow fuel made from dirty coal into our transportation fuel supply. The legislation fails to meet the test established by Speaker Pelosi earlier this year that any legislation we approve must both address America's energy dependency without increasing the threat of global warming and address the threat of global warming without increasing our energy dependency. So we have a moral obligation to ensure that we reduce our dangerous dependency on imported oil from the Middle East by making our cars and our trucks much more efficient. And we must meet that challenge posed as well by global warming. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, both from the Bush administration and its response to the Supreme Court decision, and to Congress's pending plans to reject that decision altogether, and from the states, which will be represented here as well. That concludes the opening statement of the chair. I now turn to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I deeply appreciate your convening this hearing this morning. As you've noted, given the draft that is circulated out of the Commerce Committee underscores some of the problems still at work here on Congress. And you and I, along with Mr. Cleaver, Ms. Herseth, had an opportunity this last week, starting in Greenland, but going across Europe, dealing with leaders, true leaders, in coping with the problem of global warming, underscoring the gap between the foot dragging here through EPA for the last 6 years, aided and abetted by forces in Congress that are still in denial. It's critical that we have this conversation today, and I do deeply appreciate, I applaud your leadership, that of our Speaker, who's made it clear that she, for one, has a much different view. The gap between the science, between what is happening with foreign countries where the United States torpedoed an opportunity to have real progress just this week, to what we are seeing, the lack of action by EPA for years is forcing at the local and state level initiatives. My state of Oregon is one that has joined with California in trying to deal meaningfully. We have 522 cities and hundreds of college campuses that have said, we're not waiting, we're going to move forward. But the mindset that we are seeing from the administration and some forces in Congress, if we're not equal to the challenge, are going to set us further behind, and a world that looks to the United States for leadership will continue to be perplexed and disappointed. I am hopeful that we will be able to bring into tighter focus these issues as a result of the hearing that you've scheduled here today. Look forward to hearing from our witnesses, particularly the people who are fighting for the right for states to move forward to step in where the federal government has been unable and refused. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Cleaver, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll have a very short statement. I, too, would like to express appreciation to you and Speaker Pelosi for the visionary move that allowed us to see firsthand in Greenland what is transpiring on this small balling around the sun we call Earth, and it is truly alarming. And as I have said many times recently, time is not on our side. On the front page of yesterday's Washington Post, which I'm sure the witnesses have seen, there's a photograph of a bay in Greenland. We were in this spot about 7.5 days ago, and we had the opportunity to speak with Greenlanders who are not scientists. They're not Republicans or Democrats. They're not policy wonks. They're not trying to get any pushback on global warming. They're residents, just a few of the 53,000 people who live there, and they are very clear. Their lives have changed. Global warming is real. Places where they used to slay it, now they fish. And when you look at this bay and see the blue and listen to the natives tell you that this is not supposed to be blue at this time of the year, it never has been, it is chilling. And then let me just conclude by saying it was terribly embarrassing to meet with legislators from other nations and to hear them say that they've spoken with people in this government who are still denying the science of global warming. It is my hope, it is at this point my prayer, that we will have a revolution in the way we think about this issue and begin to join the 21st century. I look forward to raising some questions with you during that period. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. It's clear that we've had states really showing some vision across the country to move to defeat this scourge of global warming. And I think the state's message should be to the federal government, that old saying, lead, follow, or get out of the way. And frankly, this administration has not led, has not followed, and has not got out of the way. And we are determined to have a federal government that will lead, much less not get out of the way. And the reason is that states historically have helped lead the country forward. You think about women's suffrage, it was Wyoming first in 1869 that moved forward, it followed by Colorado. And these states, including California and my state and Oregon and 6 others, have helped lead this country to a new energy future. And we are determined in the next several weeks to have the federal government lead, to show some leadership finally. I was in Europe with talking to other members and other governments last week with an energy subcommittee, and was asked to respond to Prime Minister Tony Blair as he spoke to an interparliamentarian group in Berlin. And I had an exchange with the Prime Minister. Basically, I was presenting the case that the President's view that we can fight global warming with voluntarism is just doomed to failure. You know, you can run a bake sale based on voluntary activity. You cannot run a war on global warming. It's sort of like the president wants to write little frilly letters to the oil company and said, would you fellows just stop polluting the planet, and expecting them to respond. That's like expecting consumers to just volunteer to pay at the pump. The voluntary system is not going to work here. And I asked the Prime Minister what he thought the best argument was to try to get the White House and this administration to finally understand why we needed binding commitments, why we needed cap-in-trade system, why we needed a renewable portfolio standard. And I thought his answer was instructive. He said, it is clear we need new technologies, and to get new technologies, we need to drive investment into those new technologies. And to drive investment in those new technologies, we need binding commitments to tell the investors that they should move to clean energy future. And I thought that was the right answer for the world, and it's the right answer for America. And I look forward to the next few weeks getting the federal government to finally show some leadership. Thank you.
Great, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Herseth Sandley.
Thank you very much, Chairman Markey. I want to thank you for having this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses. And Administrator Johnson was in South Dakota just a couple of years ago, shortly after we passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which I supported, primarily because of the renewable fuel standard that we had for the first time, that many of us from Midwestern Great Plains states had advocated for years, and finally were able to get, although we didn't get it quite at the level that we would have liked. I know that the administrator was taking steps at that time to look at the regulations necessary as it related to the production process in meeting the 7.5 billion gallon renewable fuel standard, of which we will surpass based on current projections by the end of this year, which I appreciate the opportunity this morning to explore further with our witnesses and with members of the committee the President's 35 billion gallon renewable, I wish it were renewable fuel standard requirement. I think the language is alternative fuel standard, and so I look forward to exploring the issue there, as I have done with others at the White House, with regard to renewable fuels versus alternative fuels and the importance of addressing a greenhouse gas reduction policy federally that helps lead the way internationally, as so many of our discussions on the recent congressional delegation trip to Europe identified. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the hearing, and I yield back.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. All time for opening statements by members has expired. We'll now turn to our panel.
Chairman, may I just inquire?
I'm glad to.
I don't see any of our Republican colleagues here. Was there any statement that was submitted to the record that would help us clarify any of their positions or concerns, nature and extent of the hearing today?
I would have to, if the gentleman would allow me to inquire of the minority if there are any statements. But to be fair, today was a day that the Congress was supposed to be in session. The Congress has now decided that it will not meet today, and so I think many of the Republicans have returned to their home districts as of last night morning, and I think that is something that note in fairness. Are any statements that the minority will include it in the record, but something that has to be noted in fairness. Let me turn to now recognize Stephen Johnson. Stephen Johnson was sworn in as the 11th administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency just over 2 years ago, after 26 years at the EPA. Prior to becoming administrator, he held several senior level positions, including acting administrator, deputy administrator, and held several other senior level positions, including acting assistant administrator and positions. So we welcome you, Mr. Johnson. Whenever you feel comfortable, please begin. Could you put on the microphone down there if you...
Sorry. There we go.
Okay,
We're on
great.
now.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about climate change and energy security. As you know, in Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court made several findings regarding EPA's denial of a petition to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from new motor vehicles under the Clean Air Act. EPA is moving forward to meet the Supreme Court's decision in a thoughtful, deliberative manner, considering every appropriate option and every appropriate tool at our disposal. In that context, on May the 15th, President Bush directed EPA and the Departments of Energy, Transportation, and Agriculture to coordinate our efforts in taking the first regulatory step to address greenhouse gas emissions from cars. The President called on us to base our work on his 2010 plan, which would reduce U.S. gasoline consumption by 20% over the next 10 years. This announcement both represents and responds to the Supreme Court's recent ruling and provides a path forward for improving our energy security by reducing U.S. dependence on oil. Additionally, in keeping with EPA's commitment to address the court's ruling expeditiously and responsibly, we signed the formal notice that starts the public process for considering the California waiver petition. We recently held 2 widely attended public hearings, and the public comment period remains open until June the 15th. As we continue our aggressive yet practical strategy to cut our domestic carbon footprint, the President also understands that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a global challenge. And on May 31st, the President offered a global strategy. Last week, the President called upon the world's 15 largest emitters to set a global goal on a long-term greenhouse gas reduction. The President proposed to convene a series of meetings with other countries, including rapidly growing economies like India and China, to establish a new framework for the post-2012 world. Under the framework, each country would establish midterm national targets and programs that reflect their own current and future energy needs. The President believes that by encouraging and sharing cutting-edge technologies, major emitters can meet realistic reduction goals. Both domestically and internationally, this administration is addressing the serious challenge of global climate change. As you all know, in 2002, President Bush committed to cut U.S. greenhouse gas intensity by 18% through the year 2012, a goal that we're on track to meet and even possibly exceed. According to the EPA data reported to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, U.S. greenhouse gas intensity declined by 1.9% in 2003, 2.4% in 2004, and 2.4% in 2005. Put another way, from 2004 to 2005, the U.S. economy increased by 3.2%, while greenhouse gas emissions increased by only 0.8%. Under the President's leadership, we're seeing real results. According to the International Energy Agency, from 2000 to 2004, U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide from fuel consumption grew by 1.7%, while our economy expanded by nearly 10%. The U.S. had a lower percentage increase than Japan, Canada, the original 15 countries of the European Union, India, or China. And in fact, only 2 of the original EU 15 countries in the Kyoto Protocol are on schedule to meet their Kyoto targets. Over the last 6 years, the Bush administration has invested more than any other nation in the world, $37 billion, in a comprehensive climate change agenda. EPA climate programs include a wide array of domestic and international partnerships, which rely on voluntary measures to reduce greenhouse gas intensity, spur new investments, and remove barriers to the introduction of clean technologies. I'd be happy to speak in greater detail about EPA's many climate partnership programs. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and before I take questions, I'd ask that my full written statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection, it will be included in the record. Our other very distinguished witness on the first panel is Nicole Nason, who began her duties as Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration just over a year ago, after serving as the Assistant Secretary for Governmental Affairs in the Department of Transportation since July of 2003. We welcome you. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Since the Administrator spoke about 20 and 10, in the interest of time, I thought I'd confine my remarks to CAFE this morning and that piece of the President's proposal. A key component of the 20 and 10 plan that the President has proposed is to significantly boost fuel economy for cars and for light trucks. The President's goal to raise fuel efficiency would save 8.5 billion gallons of gasoline annually in 2017. Towards that end, the administration forwarded legislation to Congress to grant the Secretary of Transportation the authority to reform CAFE for passenger cars in February. The Bush administration has a proven record in this area. We've raised CAFE standards for light trucks for 7 consecutive years, from 2005 to 2011. These higher standards are expected to save 14 billion gallons of fuel and result in a net reduction in carbon dioxide emissions of 107 million metric tons. As important, the attribute-based CAFE structure that we established promises fuel economy benefits without jeopardizing safety or causing job loss or sacrificing consumer choice. Basing our reforms on CAFE on the National Academy of Sciences, we structured the CAFE program to make it more effective and safer and fairer. And we accomplished this by using a structure that incentivizes manufacturers to add fuel-saving technologies instead of downsizing vehicles. The reform has a number of benefits. First, we believe it will result in more fuel savings than under the old CAFE because now all automakers will have to make their vehicles more fuel efficient. Second, the reform has the benefit of preserving consumer choice. Under the old CAFE program, an automaker generally manufactures a certain quantity of smaller vehicles to balance out the larger vehicles that they've been selling. Our attribute-based CAFE standard benefits new vehicle buyers by having all size vehicles, small, medium, and large, become more fuel efficient. We also tackled what the NAS called the safety penalty. The National Academy of Sciences estimated that CAFE was partially responsible for between 1,300 and 2,600 lives lost in 1 year alone. They looked at 1993. Our restructuring of CAFE incentivizes automakers to add fuel-saving technologies instead of downsizing the vehicles, and we believe we're able to minimize the safety impact. Mr. Chairman, our effort to reform CAFE will guide the way in meeting our next challenge. As you know, as the Administrator just spoke, the President has directed the Departments of Transportation and EPA, Agriculture and Energy to take steps towards regulations that would cut gasoline consumption and thus reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The steps called for in the executive order will proceed in a manner consistent with sound science, analysis of benefits and costs, safety, and economic growth. It is a complicated legal and technical matter. It will take us some time to resolve, but the President has directed us to complete this regulatory process by the end of 2008. We have received most of the manufacturers' product plans for cars, and we expect to receive their plans for light trucks shortly. Mr. Chairman, given the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Clean Air Act, there are now, in effect, 2 agencies with authority to regulate motor vehicle fuel economy and carbon dioxide tailpipe emissions. And as the President stated, our regulatory efforts are not a substitute for effective legislation. Accordingly, we continue to ask the Congress to enact the President's 2010 proposal as the most responsible way to raise fuel economy standards, reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and cut greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. And now we will turn to questions from the Select Committee. The Chair will recognize himself. Mr. Johnson, during the May 14th press conference on the President's executive order, you quoted Justice Scalia's dissenting view in the case of Massachusetts versus EPA, where you said that where it said that if you were to determine that there is endangerment associated with carbon dioxide emissions, only then would EPA be required to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. Do you believe that emissions of carbon dioxide from motor vehicles endanger public health or welfare, Mr. Johnson?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, we believe that greenhouse gas emissions and global climate change is a serious issue. And as we prepare and draft our proposed regulation for addressing greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles, we will be addressing the issue of endangerment. It's a process that we have been following since 1990.
You've been following it since 1990, but you have yet to reach a conclusion as to whether or not CO2 does in fact endanger the public health or welfare?
Let me be clear. The process of of addressing the issue of endangerment on air pollutants, we include as part of our proposed regulation, and that's what I was referring to since 1990. The issue of global climate change, as you probably are well aware, having read the Supreme Court decision, is an issue that goes back to the late 70s, in fact, 1978. The Supreme Court does an excellent job of going through the rather lengthy history of the issue of global climate change, and they go back to 1978.
Actually, it even goes back before that. I think they just picked an arbitrary date. But the question is, to you, Mr. Johnson, whether or not you agree with now the overwhelming consensus of science globally that there is an endangerment to the public health and welfare that is being caused by emittance of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's squarely on your shoulders, and your answer to that question, of course, is the central question here today. Is it an endangerment to the public health and welfare of our country and the world that CO2 is being emitted into the atmosphere?
Global climate change is a very serious issue, and the issue of endangerment under the Clean Air Act, particularly under Section 202 and 211, have to be taken into consideration as part of our regulatory determination.
Is it a danger, Mr. Johnson? Is CO2 a danger to the American people, in your opinion?
Mr. Chairman, global climate change is a very serious issue.
Is it a danger to the American people, Mr. Johnson, that CO2 in massive quantities is being emitted into the atmosphere?
We will be laying out our position on endangerment as part of our proposed regulation.
It is really difficult to believe, Mr. Johnson, that you, as the environmental minister for the United States, as the chief protector of the environment for the United States, have yet to come to a conclusion as to whether or not CO2 is in fact a danger to our people and to the people of the world. You are the last major environmental minister in the Western world that has come to a decision on this. And we should be the scientific leader, not the laggard. And to the extent to which you are still deliberating allows for this danger to build as an even greater threat to our people and to the entire world.
Mr. Chairman, the issue of endangerment is a legal term of art, as you know, that's embodied in the Clean Air Act. And as the agency has been practicing since 1990, that its position on endangerment on an air pollutant is included as part of its proposed rulemaking. My note to you again is we recognize that global warming and greenhouse gas emissions is a serious issue, and that we are addressing it through drafting regulations for controlling it through for new automobiles, and the issue of endangerment will be part of our proposed regulation.
I understand what you're saying, Mr. Johnson, but your testimony is just further evidence that the Bush administration is out of step with the science and with the world on this issue of whether or not CO2 endangers our planet and the people in our country. And I think that we are at a critical juncture at this point. It was not helpful that the White House last week, in anticipation of the G8 summit, said that the Bush administration's goals were aspirational for dealing with greenhouse gases. The White House, the Bush administration's goals are not aspirational, they're procrastinational. They want to delay dealing with this issue. They've moved now from a policy of denial that there's a problem to delay in dealing with it. And the very fact that you're not answering this question of endangerment is just further evidence of that.
Mr. Chairman, it would be irresponsible of me to make a final determination from a regulatory perspective under the Clean Air Act without having an opportunity to propose, go through notice and comment, and then make a final decision. I'm abiding by what the law directs me to do, and that is to go through a public notice and comment process. Oh, by the way, I think that's good government. And if you look at the schedule, in my 26-year history as a government employee, to write a major regulation, generally, in my experience, takes 18 to 24 months. This is a very complex regulation, and what the President has directed us to do is to write a regulation and have it final by the end of 2008. That is a very aggressive, yet we believe, practical strategy for addressing it.
Well, I think that you and I are going to disagree on that. In fact, I just have to take note at this point that neither you nor your predecessors appeared for 6 years before the lead environmental committee in the House of Representatives. And that is in and of itself a statement of the relationship that existed between the Bush administration and the Republican Congress. I mean, never before has there been such a successful witness protection program ever built that the EPA administrator did not for 6 years have to appear before the lead environmental committee in the House. And this continued policy of delay here is something that follows on that path. Let me ask just one other question, and that goes to home state and its successful case, Massachusetts versus EPA, and the decision which was rendered by the Supreme Court. As you know, before the Energy and Commerce Committee, there is now a language which actually removes the authority which the Supreme Court confirmed that that the EPA had to regulate CO2 by actually prohibiting EPA from setting national vehicle tailpipe standards. Do you support language which would remove from you the authority to be able to deal with vehicle tailpipe standards?
Mr. Chairman, we've taken no position on the legislation, but as my colleague from NHTSA pointed out, we prefer legislative fix and certainly prefer the President's 20 and 10 legislative proposal because it provides, it's less subject to litigation, it also provides certainty, and it also helps to prevent future delay.
So you have no position on legislation removing authority from your agency?
We've not taken any position on that legislation.
Okay. And final question, it also forces you to deny the state of California's waiver request to implement its own vehicle greenhouse gas standards. Do you support these provisions that remove your agency's authorities?
Again, we've taken no position on the legislation. The California petition, we're reviewing expeditiously and yet responsibly. The public comment period is still open. It closes on June the 15th. And that's the status of where we're at on the California petition.
And when are you going to rule on that?
Have not made a determination of the date.
Actually, it is quite shocking that the lead environmental agency in the United States does not have a view on the defense of its own authority to protect the environment as legislation moving through the Congress. It's just something I think at this time in our country very disturbing to the American people. Actual state of debate within the Bush administration and between Congress. Let me turn now and recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, is it the intensity of greenhouse gases or the greenhouse gases that are providing the pollution that concern us about global warming?
Greenhouse gas emissions are what are concerning us about global warming.
Thank you. You cited statistics this last year. It was only 0.8%, I believe, that emissions, 1.7% increase in transportation. At these rates, how many centuries will it take any of the other developed economies to catch up with the United States, to exceed us?
Sir, what I do know is that by analysis that the agency has done, approximately by the year 2015, the developing nations, such as India and China,
I'm not talking about
will exceed greenhouse gas emissions.
My specific question was what you cited and referenced developed countries, not China, which uses a fraction, 3 metric tons per person as opposed to our 19 metric tons.
They also have 1.3 billion
Absolutely, absolutely. How many centuries would it take any of the developed economies to pass us at this rate?
I don't know the answer to that.
Would you calculate that just to give us a sense of perspective? How many centuries? Don't need to know how many years, just how many centuries. Is there any other developed country, other than China, that is taken this laissez-faire approach that you are defending for the Bush administration? Is there any other developed country that has an approach similar to what you are advocating here today?
First of all, I have to disagree with your
characterization. I'm not going to debate that. I want to know if there's any other country that has a similar laissez-faire approach.
Again, I beg to disagree with your characterization, and in fact, as a nation, we are, in fact, the world's leader. We have spent $37 billion on advancing science and technology. That's more than any other nation in the world. I'm asking specifically, and you can't have a straight face and look at on a per capita basis, on a percentage basis, what other countries are doing in terms of, we are the largest economy in the world. We're the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. We have put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than any other country in the world. The comparison you're giving is beside the point. My question is there any other developed country that has a similar approach that you're advocating? What I do know is that the countries that are certainly part of the Kyoto Protocol, there's only 2 that are meeting their targets. The others are not. For example,
my question. So your answer is you don't know. You don't know. You can't name a single country of a developed country that is approaching this. Is what your answer is.
What I'm citing.
Can you report back to us with an answer of any country that is embracing a similar approach?
I would be happy to report back to you.
I would very much appreciate that. I had some other questions, but the one that just overwhelms me at this point. You spent 27 years in the EPA?
26.
26. Do you have any concerns about the morale, the credibility, the capability of that agency as a result of the leadership that you are providing now, the testimony you are providing now, the approach that is being advocated by this administration? Do you have any concern about its future credibility, the employee morale, the ability to be able to be up to the environmental tasks?
Sir, I'm very proud of the outstanding employees and the work that the Environmental Protection Agency has done and continues to do. In fact, for example, our Energy Star program that we in the Department of Energy administer, last year in 2006, citizens of the United States saved almost $14 billion in energy costs while saving greenhouse gas equivalents to 25 million automobiles. That's the number of automobiles in the state of California and Illinois combined. That's a program. Our
Pretty much.
SmartWise program, dealing with trucks and others, 550 companies have signed up, and we have significant savings in greenhouse gas emissions from that.
That was not my question.
Methane to market, well, your question
My question was,
is,
do you have any concern with the testimony you're giving, with the foot dragging from EPA, with our being out of step with the rest of the world? Do you have any concern about what that does for the morale, the professionalism, and the credibility of EPA? Not a few projects here or there that pale by comparison with what you can do down the street. Go to the Norwegian embassy, go to Denmark in terms of... Do you have any concerns about what impact this has on the functioning of EPA?
well, sir, I think we have a very aggressive and yet practical strategy for addressing climate change that's delivering real results. I'd also like to point out that EPA, in the independent survey, was noted this year as being one of the top 10 best places to work in the federal government. And that's a fact I'm very proud of, and we're continuing along that way.
They say more about the Bush administration than EPA, but thank you very much.
All right, gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to get into an argument about whether the United States is the headlight or the tail light with regard to dealing with this problem of climate change. I think people around the world already have pretty much answered that question. But during the Supreme Court case, the EPA argued that if it were granted the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the CAA, it would be unwise, quote, unwise to do so at this time. The EPA made the claims that doing so could conflict with the current administration's efforts to address climate change, particularly concerning international climate negotiations. So, Mr. Johnson, in your opinion, why would the EPA consider coordination by the EPA with the President's climate change initiative to be potentially conflictive?
Well, sir, one is that we certainly, and I certainly accept the Supreme Court's decision that CO2 is a pollutant, and that we are moving forward with regulating CO2 from new automobiles under the Clean Air Act. This is, the Court's decision is very complex. We are moving forward in an expeditious but responsible way for addressing greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles, and certainly we're considering the impact on other sources such as stationary sources.
I have so many questions that it's difficult to follow up because I need to ask you so many questions. I'm frankly confused about this, and as I mentioned earlier, a little embarrassed because we seem to be behind the rest of the world. Can you just quickly give your opinion as to why the 27 nations of the EU are already moving, and in many instances moving legislatively to deal with this issue, and we are not? I mean, how much time do you think we have to begin to address this issue? And if you, well, answer those first, please.
Well, first of all, I believe the U.S. is a global leader in dealing with global climate change.
Do you think anybody else in the world believes that?
Well, and I believe, I certainly believe that at very pleased that we reached an agreement at the G8, and that it has been agreed that there will be a process for rapidly developing a new comprehensive post-2012 agreement. There's agreement to establish a long-term global goal to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there was agreement that each nation should be the ones deciding on how's the best way to achieve that. And as I said, we have a very aggressive plan in the United States. We're beginning to write regulations to control greenhouse gas emissions from new automobiles.
Okay,
we have a number of partnership programs that are delivering real results, and we're making progress.
Thank you. I'm frustrated. And I'm frustrated only because, you know, I'd like to have a candid exchange, and I'm not sure that this is happening. On March 13th of this year, a draft bill aimed at moving the United Kingdom to a low-carbon economy was introduced. And without exception, the MPs that we met with last week all indicated that it was going to be approved. And in the measure, they set a 60% goal. The measure would require a mandatory 60% cut in the UK's carbon emissions by 2050 compared to the 1990 levels. And so when I see nations moving ahead like that, I'm having difficulty trying to conclude that we are the world leader. And we won't even admit that there is global warming. Do you admit it? Do you concur that there is, in fact, global warming?
Yes, as I said, in fact, the President has said since 2001 that there is concern for greenhouse gas emissions and concern over global warming. That's why we've invested $37 billion as a nation to understand and to address it.
How much longer is the understanding period?
Well, as I said, sir, we have been moving forward since 2001, and we, with the President's directive, are taking the first steps to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from new automobiles.
Thank you.
If I might just follow up with the gentleman on one question. You can't have it both ways, Mr. Johnson. You're touting the fact that you're starting to write regulations for tailpipe emissions, yet you have no view on whether or not the Congress should eliminate your authority to do so. Which is it?
Well, I leave that decision up to Congress, and certainly
So
as an administration, we have not taken a position on that.
You're saying it would be fine if the Congress removed from you
No, that's
the
not
authority.
what I said.
Yes, it is. You're
No, it
saying
isn't.
it's up to Congress. You don't have a view. You're going to sit there mute.
Said we
As
have not
the
taken a
chief
position as an administration, sir. That's what I said.
You're the environmental minister for the United States. There's a proposal to take away your authority to regulate CO2 coming from tailpipe emissions. You're touting right now that you're starting to write regulations on it, and you're saying to us that you don't have a view on whether or not Congress should take away your authority.
You're asking me to take a view of a specific piece of legislation which we have not taken a position on, and that's what I keep repeating, that we have not taken a position on. There are many ways to address environmental issues, and that can be done through a variety of mechanisms, whether it's through NHTSA and CAFE, through EPA and the Clean Air Act, or other pieces of legislation.
Your silence, Mr. Johnson, is deafening, because it is a silence that the entire administration has had towards these issues for the entire 6.5 years that it has been in office. Let me turn now and recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Could you give us your response to the NASA report of May 30th, 2007, about the Earth's climate?
I'm not personally familiar with that specific report.
This is a report, the headline is, "Research finds that Earth's climate is approaching, quote, dangerous, close quote, point." You've read that, I assume.
Well, the reports that I have read are the IPCC, the International Program on Climate Change, and certainly as an administration, we've not only invested in those through money and our own scientists, but certainly we support what the IPCC reports say.
Well, that's impressive, but you're telling me the director of the Environmental Ministry of the United States has not read the report just a few weeks ago indicating the United States is coming to tipping points, and did you not read the conclusion of the lead author, James Hansen, who said, quote, If global emissions of carbon dioxide continue to rise at the rate of the past decade, this research shows that there will be disastrous effects, including increasingly rapid sea level rise, increased frequency of droughts and floods, and increased stress on wildlife and plants due to rapidly shifting climate zones, close quote. Now, are you telling me that you were unfamiliar with that research?
What I can tell you is the
That's pretty
second
simple
IPCC
question.
report, if you'd like me to answer the question, I'd be happy to.
A yes or no would be handy.
Well, what I'm telling you is that according to the IPCC, extreme weather, climate and sea level impacts due to climate change are very likely.
I just want to make sure that I understand this, and so does the American public. Are you telling me that the lead minister of the environmental agency of the United States, the director of the EPA, is unfamiliar with the most recent NASA research, which indicated we were approaching a tipping point which could tip the climatic system of the world within 10 years? I just want to know, did you read that or not?
I have not read that report.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And your policies are consistent with not reading the science coming out of the federal government.
That's a very unfair characterization, sir.
Well, I read it.
There are thousands. Well, that's good for you. Did you read the IPCC report?
Yes, I have read it actually in considerable detail. Let me ask you this: when under the President Bush's policies and your policies, when will we reach a tipping point which will tip us into major climatic shifts in the world? When will that occur?
It is still an issue of scientific debate.
And when, according to your targets, when will the world reach doubling of CO2 from pre-industrial levels?
Again, depending upon whose projections, I don't have a specific date, but a number of scientists have various opinions on when that might occur.
And tell me this, when do you believe it should be allowed to occur? What is the target that you believe the world should have to eliminate this catastrophic threat? What target should we have and what year?
Well, that's precisely why the President proposed at the G8 summit to bring people together to establish what that target should be and what steps then each nation should take to help achieve that target.
We've been reading these reports now for over a decade. Are you telling me that the lead person for the Environmental Protection Agency cannot give us a target that the world should have to limit the amount of carbon dioxide to prevent these catastrophic effects? Is that what you're telling me? You can't give me a number or a date?
No, I won't give you a number. I'm saying is that there are many opinions, and we think that it's important for the nations, both developed and developing nations, to get together to identify what that goal or that target should be, and then take steps at the national level.
And what is the United States position on that? What should the target be?
We have not made a position yet.
We're paying a lot of tax money. You told me we spent, $35 billion on this, and you can't come up with a number the United States should propound? Is that what you're telling me? Where'd that money go?
What I'm saying is that we have not identified a specific number. We think that there's a lot of science that leads to a wide range of numbers, and that's why we think that it's important for us to discuss it in an international context.
I can tell you that my constituents are grossly embarrassed by that response, that the leading nation in the world technologically, who took a man to the moon, cannot establish an international target as the head of the EPA who can't give us what the target should be is grossly unsatisfactory. And it's like saying that, we're going to have a meeting next year to talk about whether or not we should try to get Osama bin Laden. We should have a clear target by now in the United States of America. And I cannot for the life of me understand why you can't give us what you think should be safe for Americans on that level. And I hope someday you can do that, because we intend to create one in the United States Congress. My time has expired.
Great, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Hersa Sandlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated in my opening statement, the area I'd like to pursue with you today is sort of these perhaps interim regulatory steps the administration plans to take, but I would assume with notion that it would inform the legislative process that we are debating here in Congress with regard to the dual objectives of energy independence and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. One piece of the administration's 20 and 10 plan is the alternative fuels standard It would require 35 billion gallons of alternative renewable fuels available by 2017. And I strongly supported, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the 7.5 billion gallon standard in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. So I appreciate the additional initiative from the administration. And I know in visiting directly with the President, he feels strongly about this initiative, and he doesn't want to do anything to undercut his own initiative. So I would raise with you the question I raised with him and other members of his staff about the issue of the particular mix of energy sources that the administration envisions in satisfying this requirement. If you could comment on that, Administrator Johnson, any conversations you've had as the agencies work together. Perhaps Secretary Johans has voiced interest or concerns about this particular mix. And then you, in your position in particular, are you considering the relative greenhouse gas footprints of the fuels in that portfolio?
The answer is yes to your last question. As part of our developing our proposed regulation for addressing greenhouse gases from automobiles, there's really two ways of addressing...
Well, before I get to
Okay.
that, though, I want to talk precisely about the energy mix. And so what's
Yes.
anticipated in the 35 billion gallon initiative, because I do have a question for you as it relates to Minnesota, and when we get to these state initiatives and what they're doing and how your agency is responding. But when you say yes, you are considering the different footprints, may I inquire further elaboration as it relates to renewable energy sources such as cellulosic ethanol versus coal to liquid in meeting that 35 billion gallon target?
With regard to the legislation and the 35 billion gallons, the legislation was presented and certainly announced in the State of the Union. It was focused on two things: one, energy security, and second, addressing environmental concerns, particularly global climate change. In our proposal, I would perhaps refer to it as technology neutral. That is, that we identified a number of technologies ranging from corn ethanol to soybean biodiesel to cellulosic ethanol, as well as you point out, coal to liquid. And so in our proposal, we were being technology neutral, but believe that with advances in technology, both for cellulosic as well as even coal to liquid, that we would see improvements both in the technology being more cost effective as well as also addressing environmental concerns, particularly in the area of coal to liquid.
But our experience tells us, if you look just at the renewable fuel standard of 7.5 billion gallons and how we've structured different tax incentives, that one fuel can overwhelm another. We've seen that with ethanol versus biodiesel, which is why I proposed separate standards for those fuels and carve-outs for cellulosic ethanol. Have there been any discussions with your agency and others about separating out, understanding the what motivates the technology neutral position, but how about as these technologies are advancing that we don't have the possibility of coal to liquid, which doesn't have the kind of footprint in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that ethanol production does, cellulosic ethanol in particular, about separating out the standards for which we're reaching an aggregate of 35 billion?
We in some of our scenarios that we ran to determine this ambitious goal of 35 billion gallons, we looked at a variety of combinations, and we believe that certainly cellulosic ethanol plays a very significant role in helping the nation achieve 35 billion gallons.
Do you believe that we can achieve 35 billion gallons with renewable fuel sources alone, or do we need alternative and need coal to liquid?
Well, those are part of the discussions that we need to have. We think there's opportunity for all, certainly from an environmental perspective, and as we move forward on the regulation of fuel for addressing greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, certainly the carbon footprint will be an issue that we have to address. The greenhouse gas emission is something we have to address for all the alternative fuels.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire if I may ask one additional follow-up question on the issue of the state initiatives? I know that some of the folks spent on California's initiative. We may be pursuing that more with the next panel. Could you provide me and the rest of the committee an update on your work with the state of Minnesota as it relates to evaluating the greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles with higher blends of ethanol? Currently only a 10% ethanol blend is approved, but the Minnesota State Legislature has acted in a way that would increase that blend to 20% ethanol. And if you could address that both as it relates to what you're doing with new automobiles and your regulatory authority, but also existing automobiles in the fleet, those that are maybe only a decade old versus those which are pre-1995.
Please do. Would you like me to respond now? Mr. Chairman, yeah, we're actively working with the state to, and in fact, this summer we're expecting data to help us better understand the 20%. I mean, the questions that we need to address to make sure that the 20% blend doesn't have a negative impact on emissions or the equipment. And we're working with all the stakeholders, including the state, as well as the automobile industry, fuel manufacturers, and others, Department of Energy, and others to make sure. So we're very much interested in and reviewing and considering the proposal.
And the lady's time has expired, and we'll go for a second round here. There are some other questions I think that has to unearth before we reach the second panel. Let me ask you, Mr. Johnson, if you're going to regulate fuels by setting an alternative fuel standard, following up on Sandlin's question, if you're going to regulate fuels by setting an alternative fuel standard under Section 211 of the Clean Air Act, you have to have made an endangerment finding. How can you reconcile an endangerment finding with the promotion of coal to liquids, which has dramatically higher greenhouse gas emissions than renewable fuels, and have the administration be making that proposal to the Congress?
Well, as part of, Mr. Chairman, as part of our analysis of our developing our proposed regulation, we will be evaluating the coal to liquid as well as other alternative fuels to make sure that they'll meet what we end up proposing for regulating greenhouse gases for new automobiles. So that's a very important question and important consideration.
Well, I think it's a conflict for the administration. First, you're saying you haven't had time to make an endangerment finding, but simultaneously, you're proposing a coal to liquids program for the United States. And it just seems to me that you've got a responsibility to issue your endangerment finding, and do so soon, given the fact that Congress is now considering your coal to liquids proposal. And I think that there's an urgency to it. You have no time really left, and if Congress moves forward, it will be because you didn't resolve this conflict, and it's squarely on your shoulders to decide whether or not this coal to liquids is something that is going to endanger us with additional CO2 emissions. Mr. Johnson, you've pointed out that assuming you do move forward with a rulemaking as a result of the Supreme Court decision, you will be required to find that carbon dioxide emissions from vehicles endanger public health or welfare in order to do so. Assuming that you do make that finding, is it safe to say that EPA would also have concluded that carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and other stationary sources pose such a danger, and that emissions therefore also must be regulated under the Clean Air Act?
Sir, the Supreme Court's decision, which, as you know, as we've been discussing, focuses on motor vehicles, and with regard to impact on other sources under the Clean Air Act, we're in the process of evaluating that now.
just to put a fine point on this, if it's a danger, if CO2 is a danger coming from tailpipes, would it not also be a danger coming from utilities or coming from industrial stationary sources?
From a legal standpoint and under the terms under the Clean Air Act, that's one of the important questions that we're reviewing right now.
A rose is a rose. CO2 is CO2, Mr. Johnson. It would really be helpful to us if you could just give us some confidence that if you find that CO2 is a problem coming out of tailpipes, that you also think it's a problem coming out of utilities, other industrial stationary sources. Not satisfactory answer. Let me turn to you, Ms. Nason. The Bush administration, President Bush in his State of the Union address recommended that we increase the fuel economy standards by 4% per year over the next 10 years. Let me just show you a chart, Ms. Nason, because I think this can be helpful to you so you can understand why this proposal is so important and why this Massachusetts versus EPA decision and the California statute are so important. In 1977, we reached 46% dependence upon imported oil. It ramped up very quickly from a very small percentage over a 7-year period to 46.5% dependency on imported oil. But the Congress passed a law saying that the fuel economy standards for the American automotive fleet had to be doubled over a 10-year period. And so while it was at 13.5 miles per gallon in 1975, it mandated that by 1986 it be doubled to 27 miles per gallon. And you can see what happened after that law went into effect. We dropped down by 1985 and 86 to only 27% dependence upon imported oil. And our consumption of oil dropped, and as a result, the carbon footprint coming from our automotive sector dropped dramatically. However, then, unfortunately, until today, a 20-year period, no significant increases in fuel economy standards has been promulgated. And in fact, we've now slipped backwards from the standard we reached in 1986, back from 27 back to about 25 miles per gallon. And so as a result, we are now 60% dependent upon imported oil. In other words, we increased from 27% dependence on imported oil to 60% dependence on imported oil in just 20 years. Now, we have 170,000 young men and women over in Iraq. 1.6 million Americans have now served over there in Iraq. 1.6 million Americans have gone over there. And while the administration has used some justification for being over there, we now realize it wasn't a nuclear weapons program. They knew for sure before the war started that there was no nuclear weapons program in Iraq and that there was no al-Qaeda connection. This place as a source of oil, the Middle East is a place that we, in fact, receive our oil from, becomes increasingly important. If we increased to 35 miles per gallon, which is 4% per year, that actually backs out all of the oil which we import from the Persian Gulf. And so the President's proposal becomes very important. In the past, while rhetorically saying the right things, we've found that on many of these environmentally related issues, the actions have not followed. So my first question to you, Ms. Nason, is, does the President want you to mandate that this 35 miles per gallon standard be reached by 2017, 18, or 19? A mandate, Ms. Nason.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, could I just talk about the chart for one second? As you know, most of oil use that we bring in is gasoline. It's about 45%, another roughly 15% for diesel. So transportation accounts for our greatest use of oil. One of the things that we saw happen in the fleet in the 80s, again, as you know, is that the mix changed dramatically from cars to light trucks. And there was a far greater percentage, it's half now, light trucks versus cars, compared to where it was in the 70s and into the early 80s. And so that did change. While we have seen greater fuel economy in cars, the increase in the fleet of light trucks, SUVs as cars for people, did have an impact on overall fuel economy, as I know you know. And the President's proposal, the 8.5 billion gallons that he talked about in the State of the Union, and the really only way to get there is to do roughly a 4% increase in CAFE year over year to 2017, which is the 2010 proposal, does not contain 4% in writing, as we've discussed. It is a goal. It is a target. It is something that we take obviously very seriously and we would work very hard to meet, but it is not something that we have put in writing in the statute, because the President has also said that he'd like to see us do full comprehensive rulemaking, weigh all of the factors that we need to weigh, and that our target should be 4%, but we didn't put it in writing in the 2010 proposal.
Yes, that's the problem. And the problem is that the administration has yet to say anything about the proposal which is before the Congress right now, that in draft form, which calls for an increase of only 1.7% per year through the year 2022. So would this administration would you oppose any legislation which will undermine your goal of 4%? In other words, will this administration oppose language which sets a goal not of 4%, but of only 1.7%?
I think the best answer I can give you at the moment, Mr. Chairman, is that, as we've said, we really would like to work with the Congress to get the authority to reform the program. I think the place we do have agreement, I've looked at your legislation and others, is on reforming the program. I think where we have disagreement is on stringency levels. I hope.
And here's the problem with the President and with your agency, Ms. Nason. What he wants to be able to say in the State of the Union is that this is a goal which is achievable for our country. It's critical for the national security of our country. But he's not willing to mandate it. And in fact, if Congress wants to cut his goal in half, which is what it is now saying, this administration won't say anything about it, has no recommendation on it. And so we wind up with the administration setting a goal, but it's not mandated, having Congress propose something, some key Congress people propose that they cut the goal in half, have the administration say nothing about it, and then we're supposed to believe that this administration cares about, one, this huge importation of oil from OPEC, and this rising concern about global warming. And it doesn't square, Ms. Nason. The actions of the President do not square up with the promise that he has made to the American people on these issues. Let me ask one other question. Mr. Johnson has been given authority under EPA versus Massachusetts to regulate CO2. The legislation which is now pending before the Energy Committee would strip Mr. Johnson of his ability to regulate and strip his ability to give to the states their ability to regulate. Do you support that legislation? Do you believe that the EPA is not a proper place to have jurisdiction over this issue?
Well, I think we're working very well together as the President directed for 2010. If you're asking what I do support, I support 2010. That's the President's proposal.
I'm asking now about this very critical jurisdictional issue, which is at the heart of this hearing and the heart of the legislative debate which we're having right now in this city. Do you support this legislation which would strip the authority from EPA and repose it exclusively in your own agency?
The draft committee report.
That's correct.
I think, as Mr. Johnson has, as the administrator has made clear, sir, we don't have an official administration position on the draft legislation or many of the other bills that we see going through the House and Senate, but we do look forward to working with you to try to get legislation through this Congress.
Is the goal of your agency, the mandate of your agency, to look after the health of our country?
No, sir.
It is not, is it?
No.
No. Mr. Johnson's agency has the responsibility to look after the health of our country. If CO2 is found to be a pollutant, and it is something which is endangering the health or welfare of our country, he has a responsibility to do something about it. You, on the other hand, have a responsibility to increase the fuel economy of our vehicles while ensuring that safety is maintained. That's a different responsibility. Do you have a problem with Mr. Johnson having the authority to be able to protect the health of our country?
I have no problem with the administrator.
Well, I'm talking about him having the authority to protect the health and welfare of our country. Do you have a problem with that, Ms. Nason?
With health and welfare, no, sir.
So
Out on a limb.
No, I have no problem with
well, there is language in the draft bill which we are now going to be considering next week in Congress, which would strip Mr. Johnson of his ability to deal with that issue. So that's a problem, and it's something that obviously concerns this panel greatly, and I would hope that it would concern the President, although I'm really assured that he has drawn his attention to it. Let me turn and recognize the gentleman from Oregon if he has any questions.
Chairman, I do has a claim to.
Okay, let me recognize the gentleman from Washington State.
Thank you. The world is rapidly reaching a consensus that we have to stop CO2 from going beyond a doubling of CO2 from pre-industrial levels, and eventually even your administration will reach that conclusion, I'm confident. But your administration continues to insist that we can cut our emissions of CO2 in half or more, which we have to do to reach that target, by voluntary mechanisms. And somehow if the President just asks American industrial leaders to cut their CO2, sends them a nice letter on nice stationery, that they'll just voluntarily cut their CO2. But when your administration wants to test our kids and No Child Left Behind, not a voluntary program, don't get to make that decision. We require our kids to perform. Why does your administration require fifth graders to perform, but expects voluntary decisions by CEOs of the largest corporations in the world to sort of volunteer to solve this problem?
Let me first comment that, again, we have a wide array of partnership programs that are delivering results. In addition, as we've been talking about, we're in the process of writing regulations, mandatory regulations to control greenhouse gases from new automobiles. So it is what our overall approach includes an array of partnership programs, and includes now this mandatory program of addressing greenhouse gas emissions from new automobiles.
But your proposal will specifically reject what the rest of the industrialized world has embraced, at least in European Union, a cap-and-trade system to have a mandatory enforceable cap on CO2. You have rejected a renewable portfolio standard, which will give Americans the guarantee they will have renewable clean energy. You have rejected meaningful enforceable standards for green building requirements. You've rejected virtually every significant thing other than baby steps at most. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct.
Well, are you going to embrace the cap-and-trade system? This is news to me. Let the Eagles roll here.
Yeah, let's start with the list. We have not rejected a renewable fuel portfolio standard. In fact, it wasn't that many weeks ago that I signed the final regulation imposing the 7.5 billion gallon requirement on the United States.
So are you suggesting...
And we are, as part of our regulation of dealing with automobile greenhouse gas emissions, there are only two ways. There's no special catalytic converter that you can put on an automobile or a light truck to address greenhouse gas emissions. There's two ways. There's one to address the fuel and to address the engine efficiency.
So I don't have a lot of time, and there's a plane. Are you suggesting to Congress that we adopt a renewable portfolio standard to give Americans the assurance we'll have a certain degree of electricity from clean, renewable energy sources?
I believe that we should be working together to achieve our energy security goals and environmental goals.
Will the President sign a bill that has a renewable portfolio standard in it?
Well, I look forward to working with you to address that issue.
Will the President sign a bill that has a cap-and-trade system in it?
No.
That's unfortunate, and I think you're premature, and I hope you are. Because the world is looking for America to reclaim leadership, the country that established democracy, the country that put a man on the moon, to have a White House stand in the schoolhouse door of the most effective thing we can do to preserve the environment for our kids. And I hope you haven't checked with the President. I hope you're not authorized to say that. Because if we're going to have a meaningful dialogue with the White House, they've got to keep that door open. Because it is the single most effective thing that we can do for our grandkids. And I hope that you go back and check with the White House again and said, you know, maybe I spoke a little too soon in answering that question. Because I heard the President say he wants to turn over a new leaf, sort of, in Europe the other day. And I hope that happens for my grandkids and yours. So I just hope you have that conversation. I got one other question. Maybe I don't. I think you've made enough points. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I think he made his point. Gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you for allowing me to shift. I will be very brief. I just have two additional follow-ups. I'm listening to Mr. Johnson, your rhetoric about the commitment and the progress that is being made. I believe I read a GAO report that you have missed 34 consecutive deadlines for upgrading appliance efficiency standards. This administration has missed 34 consecutive deadlines for appliance efficiency.
Well, we've been working effectively with Department of Energy to help establish efficiency standards, and there are some technical issues.
Has this administration missed 34 consecutive deadlines for increasing appliance efficiency standards?
I would have to get back to you for the record, sir.
In the ballpark? Is that in the GAO in the ballpark?
I'm familiar with the GAO report on the specifics.
Some of the smart people behind you know?
Well, if GOE has the responsibility for promulgating, is what my note says. Sir.
Yeah. So you're going to punt. I would just respectfully suggest that actions do speak louder than words, and the failure of this administration to meet 34 consecutive deadlines for increasing appliance efficiency speaks volumes about the commitment of things that would actually make a difference, a sense of urgency. And it's another reason why I am, it's hard to take what you're saying at face value when little, tiny steps that are already established in law, this administration can't figure out how to do. I could understand 1 out of 10, maybe 2 out of 10, batting only 400, but 0 for 34 strikes me that you and the administration aren't serious. Which leads me to my other question in advance of hearing from Attorney General Brown and others we have, as I understand, you have not yet announced a timeline for making a final decision on the waiver request. Is that true?
That's correct.
Can you give us some hint of what the timeline is going to be? You've been sitting on this now, doing whatever you're doing for 10 weeks since the decision. It's been bubbling since 2005. Do people have to sue again to get a deadline?
Well, as I mentioned, we're expeditiously and responsibly following the statutory process, which requires a hearing. The state of California
I don't want you to have to repeat what you've already said. That's why I asked, do you have a deadline that these people can count on? Is it going to be in 3 weeks, 3 months?
What I've said to the state of California and others is that I want to wait until the close of the comment period, which is next Friday, have an opportunity to assess the nature of the comments, and then we'll make a specific decision as to the timing of when we will make a decision.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman very much, and I would note that I am the author of the 1987 Appliance Efficiency Law that the administration has missed all 34 deadlines in 6 years, and applying in imposing higher standards for efficiency for all of those devices which we use in our country. And of course, because they missed all 34 deadlines over 6.5 years, dozens of new coal-fired plants have to be built to generate the electricity for the less efficient appliances which we use in our country, contributing, endangering our atmosphere with those additional emissions for refrigerators, stoves, whatever that could have been much more efficient. Let me turn and recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleveland.
And those coal plants are producing about 520,000 tons of nitrogen oxide, which is polluting the atmosphere, equal to about 500,000 automobiles. But I want to return to the lawsuit, the Supreme Court case, I'm sorry. You argued, Mr. Johnson, that the regulation of CO2s would require the regulation of fuel economy standards, which you stated is the jurisdiction of Ms. Nason. But the Supreme Court then responded by saying that it recognized that the multi-agency efforts were needed to address certain issues. And then the court stated, and I quote, "The fact that the DOT's mandate to promote energy efficiency by setting mild standards may overlap with the EPA's environmental responsibilities in no way licenses EPA to shirk its duty to protect the public health and welfare," unquote. So I'd like to ask both of you, actually, recognizing the Supreme Court decision, is there now ongoing work between the two agencies since the court decision, and what direction is it going if, in fact, there has been a response to the Supreme Court's directive?
The one-word answer is yes. We are working together post the Supreme Court decision.
I'm sorry?
I said yes, we are working together post the Supreme Court decision, and it's following what the President's executive order directing us to do, and that is to work together to develop a regulation that will regulate greenhouse gas emissions from new automobiles.
Did that, I mean, were you working together prior to the Supreme Court's decision on this?
Well, we work very closely together because one of EPA's roles and responsibilities as part of fuel economy is to calculate fuel economy. That's the window sticker in the windows. And as I'm sure you're probably well aware, I issued a rule last December which actually significantly improves that window sticker for the 2008 model year. And we work together in the CAFE program. We do tests. The automobile industry does tests, emission tests. We share that information with our colleagues at NHTSA and Department of Transportation to enable them to monitor and calculate CAFE. So we have a long-standing relationship together.
Thank you. The reason I raise the question is the fact that your attorneys suggested that that it was the DOT's responsibility. I mean, arguing before the Supreme Court, which would also suggest that there was not prior work together.
Well, we've been working together for years on the issue of air pollutants and engine efficiency as well as fuels.
Well, why would your attorneys argue that it was the DOT's responsibility?
My recollection is that
I have it right here.
Okay, it was my recollection because of the CAFE, because Department of Transportation is responsible for the CAFE standard, not EPA.
Ms. Nason, is that
yes,
your understanding?
Congressman, I think there was concern about not having overlapping regulations, and as you just said, the Supreme Court's word there was overlap. Yes, there may be overlap in the obligations now, but we are certain that the agencies can work together to resolve that.
Seamlessly.
You've seen that, and we are. We can enforce CAFE without the help of the EPA even before this. So that's what we're working together to do. That was the President's directive in May 14th.
I'm glad this is being televised because I think the people around the nation are weeping with joy because two federal agencies are working together, holding hands, walking under the great moonlight. My final question relates to deforestation. Scientists have, of course, if we don't agree that the scientists, some dumb scientists have concluded that that the loss of natural forest around the world contributes more to global emissions each year than the transport sector. And so, if that is, do you agree with that, Mr. Johnson?
Well, we don't. EPA does not have responsibility for the forests of our nation or global forests, but certainly from an administration perspective, we are concerned about global deforestation and believe that across the globe steps need to be taken to avoid deforestation.
That's the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. Don't you agree?
It is a way of. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. Yes.
Okay. I don't know of anything that's more cost-effective than just saying that we're not going to cut down a tree. And so I'm just wondering what international effort is underway, or is there any dialogue going on the subject in terms of the deforestation of around the globe?
I would, if I could, sir, get back to the record for you. As I said, it's not EPA's responsibility, but certainly be happy to have our colleagues that are. I know that our State Department and others are intimately involved in helping to address this issue, and we'll have a response back to you.
Thank you. It is my hope that there's been a lot said over the last week or so from the administration, and it is my hope that at some point there will be more done than said. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, follow-up observation from the comments and questions from Mr. Inslee and Mr. Blumenauer, and then just a follow-up question for you, Administrator Johnson, along the lines that I was pursuing earlier. When we were in Brussels a couple of weeks ago with Speaker Pelosi, I raised the issue with President Barroso about an interim target that the European Union had set for renewable fuel usage for 2005 and the fact that they missed that target. And I asked President Barroso and others in the room what the reasons were for missing that target. And the explanation was the fact that it was voluntary and no one took it seriously. And given our own experience with a mandatory cap and trade for sulfur dioxide emissions, given our own experience that President Bush seems to have acknowledged with a mandatory 7.5 billion gallon renewable fuel standard that has now led to his initiative of a 35 billion alternative fuel standard, I do hope, as Mr. Inslee stated, that that indicates some willingness of President Bush to work with us as we move forward to recognize the importance of mandatory policies that reach the objectives and the importance of making them mandatory to meet the objectives, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and our own experience here in the United States with a cap-and-trade system, as well as with these alternative fuel mandates. My follow-up question for you on the Minnesota studies that are going on, I know you had mentioned that we'd be getting data sometime this summer, but does the EPA have any sort of timeline or deadline for then assessing that data and making a decision about whether or not to approve something other than a 10% blend of ethanol with gasoline?
We don't, because part of the reason we don't know when the data are going to come in or what the nature and extent of the data are. As I said, we're working very cooperatively with the state and others to help address the issue.
But some of the data will be available this summer.
Yes, but again, I don't know what will be or won't be, and will it be sufficient to be able to make a determination. Again, we're operating in an open and transparent way to address the issues of, again, emissions as well as the engine and whether, in fact, they can accommodate a higher blend of ethanol. Certainly, our hope is that the engineering and all the answers will point us in the direction of the ability to do higher blends. We certainly support E85, for example, because it's good for the economy. It's good from an energy security standpoint, and it also has a better environmental profile. So.
Well, I agree with you on all that, but given that we're still struggling to get E85 pumps available across the country, we've got to deal with the existing domestic fleet as Detroit manufactures more flex fuel vehicles, and many of us believe that the data will support that the existing domestic fleet can take something higher than an E10 blend, and so I would appreciate it if you could keep this committee, as well as the committees of jurisdiction I know are similarly interested in this issue, apprised once the data comes in this summer, so that we can also evaluate what the initial studies and analysis looks like. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll be pleased to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Nason, let me just do one final line of question. The four of us who are here, along with Speaker Pelosi, visited first Greenland 10 days ago, observe this incredible phenomenon which is occurring, rapidly intensifying pace of melt movement of the ice cap and glaciers and icebergs that, if it ever happened, would lead to a 20-foot rise in the sea levels of the world. A frightening experience. I recommend to you, Mr. Johnson, that you go to it and that you see what's happening in Greenland, to you as well, Ms. Nason, so that you can understand fully the danger, not just to those that live in Greenland, but to those who live in the United States, those who live in Florida, those who live in the coastlines of our country, if this phenomenon ever did occur. And if we're going to stop it, we have to start now. If we're going to protect people from something that happened 50 and 100 years from now, we have to start now. And by the way, 70% of all people who will be alive 70% of the people alive today will be alive in the year 2050. Not doing it, but some theoretical group of people. 70% of all people living today. We have a responsibility to protect them. Now, in Europe, what we found was that they're mandating in Europe a 43.4 miles per gallon standard by the year 2012. Ms. Nason. They're already at 35 miles per gallon. You're telling us today that you can't commit to a 35 mile per gallon standard 10 years from now, that you can't commit that it will be mandatory, And yet the Europeans are going to meet a 43.4 mile per gallon standard by 2012, only 5 years from now. And not only BMW and Daimler Chrysler and Volkswagen, but Ford and General Motors have said they'll meet the European standard. And Ford and General Motors are the leading automotive companies in terms of sales in Europe. Why, Ms. Nason, can't we meet that standard? Why can't we at least say we'll do 10 years from now what the EU is doing today?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was in Germany last November and then in Japan last week, and I'm going to Brussels next week to meet with essentially the NHTSA counterpart woman over there. They had voluntary standards in place, which my understanding was the manufacturers had all said they couldn't possibly meet. And this was some of the difficulties that they were having. In Germany, they were saying they couldn't meet the European standards, and we had some very, I think, interesting discussions with the Japanese government about their CAFE and how they would like to see changes. I haven't seen Ford or GM say that they could meet 43 miles per gallon. That would be very interesting.
I talked to the American Chamber of Commerce in Europe, and they said they're meeting the standard. Matter of fact, every American company that does business in Europe has signed off on and said they will meet the goals that the EU is setting for a cap-and-trade system for emissions across all industries as well. That all the American companies doing business over there, which are all of our biggest companies, will meet that European standard.
They have different, as you know, they certainly have a different fuel mix, fleet mix in Europe. I think half the fleet in Europe is diesels, and most of those diesels wouldn't meet the clean diesel requirements in the United States. So there are alternative ways that they could meet a standard that they might not be able to meet in the United States. You know, there's far greater penetration of diesels in the marketplace in Europe, and I think that they are looking to bring clean diesels to the United States. I've seen Chrysler, for example, is looking to make them their Jeep line diesels, borrowing perhaps on what Daimler had been doing in Europe with the Mercedes diesel. So I do think that technology is going to make the difference in how they can meet the standards in the U.S.
We're not looking for us to take on a task that's impossible. Let me just ask you one final question. The Ford Escape SUV hybrid gets 36 miles per gallon. Is the Ford Escape SUV hybrid less safe than the Ford Escape SUV?
No, sir.
No, it's the same safety, but with 40% higher mileage. So we're not really asking for you, Ms. Nason, to take on this responsibility, to ask our automotive industry to do something that's impossible. It's something that they're already doing. We're asking you to set this goal for 2017 or 2018 that can meet that national challenge. And it is critical that you do it. We didn't hear the right answers today with regard to it being mandated or being 35 miles per gallon. What we've heard here today is that initiatives to reduce carbon emissions, such as tailpipe standards or even fuel economy standards, are being stalled, while initiatives that increase carbon emissions, such as coal to liquids, are being encouraged. I suggest that President Bush is in danger of cementing his place in history as an environmental Emperor Nero, a man who fiddled as civilization burned down around him. And it is very important that this administration understands the threat to this planet. Thank both of you for your testimony here today. We will be working in close conjunction with you for the next year and a half. Speaker Pelosi has made it quite clear that she wants to see a dramatic reduction in imported oil, and it also wants a mandatory cap-and-trade system passed the United States Congress and to be placed upon the desk of the President. That's going to require the two of you sitting here to be the central players in accomplishing these goals. We hope that, and we know that this will be the first of many visits that you have back before the select.
Thank you.
And now we'll move to our second panel. Our second panel is here in order to ensure that we get to the heart of the matter in Massachusetts versus EPA and the California statute. Here for cannot find. Our second panel couldn't be more distinguished. We'll first recognize former California Governor and now Attorney General of California, Jerry Brown, who has a long history of public service that cannot be overstated. He is someone who from the beginning of his career has been identified with the environmental movement and the protection of the environment in our country. We welcome you, Governor Brown. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of hard to know where to begin after having listened to that exercise in obfuscation. I don't blame the deputies of the Bush administration, since obviously they're under discipline and under orders to stall and stonewall, which I guess they've done about as good a job as you could expect. I did examine the administrator's testimony with some care, and I guess the central fallacy is very well stated on page 4, where he says, and he mentioned similar sentiments during his testimony, quote, "This is a complicated legal and technical matter that will take time to fully resolve." Well, not in California, because we've already resolved it. We've resolved the technical issues and the legal issues. We have a comprehensive plan ready to go to control emissions of greenhouse gases from automobiles. We're in the process of working up and then promulgating a comprehensive control strategy to cover power plants and industrial emitters and all other sources of greenhouse gases that California has the authority to regulate. It's clear from the evidence that the Bush administration has been opposing efforts. I thought it was interesting in your comments about appliance efficiency standards. When I was governor, my Energy Commission adopted appliance energy efficiency standards and building efficiency standards, by the way, in I think it was 1983 by the time they became final. And then the Reagan administration adopted a no standard to preempt it. So this is an old story. In fact, it's a very old story about the waiver, because back in the good old days when we had a movie actor representing California by the name of George Murphy, and he defended the California waiver against the gentleman from Dearborn, Michigan, and the honorable congressman argued very strenuously, but his measure to gut the California waiver was defeated. And the legislative history will clearly demonstrate and portray that Senator Murphy, and there was another congressman by the name of Smith, all felt California had a pioneering role to play, and that was the purpose of the waiver, to enable California to lead the nation, set standards, and that view was then reaffirmed and extended in subsequent years when the Clean Air Act was amended to allow other states like Massachusetts and Oregon to copy California once the standard was enacted. So we actually have two standards. We have a national standard, which often is no standard, and we have the California standard, and the 50 states or the 49 other states can pick. I think we have to recognize here that this is not so easy. I noticed the administrator comment that some of the European countries and signatories to the Kyoto Protocol weren't doing so well. Well, nobody's doing too well, including the people of this earth and this world that we're living in, because CO2 is rising. According to the National National Academy of Science, CO2 rose about almost 3 times faster in the last 4 years than had been previously thought. So things are getting worse. And the fact that the administrator tells you that the emissions only grew by 0.8% and the intensity's going down doesn't mean too much when you realize that vehicle miles driven are going up. Coal plants are on the horizon here in great numbers, and then you have China building a coal plant every week. We're facing a very difficult problem, and if you listen and you really step back and look at this testimony, you want to know your call here on this meeting was what's our view of the Bush's response? What's California doing? Well, I think the president's response is laid out here. And when I use the word obfuscation, I lay it out very carefully. There's a lot of little stuff here. There's a this and a that, and maybe this $37 billion, I'm not quite sure what it goes to. It may be helpful, it may not be. But the key term has to be measurement of carbon, a measurable target that will be a cap that will express a comprehensive cap for the country as part of a larger cap for the world, but we have to start with our own country. We need that cap, and then by sector, there will be a subsidiary cap. Now, when it comes to transportation, that's 28% of the greenhouse gas in America come from transportation, and automobiles are about 20% of that if you take into account the upstream emissions that are required just to build the cars and to produce the fuel. So you have to look at a life cycle measurement. California has already embarked upon a low carbon fuel standard. And that standard that is being spearheaded by Governor Schwarzenegger and the California Air Resources Board sets a 10% reduction within a fixed period of time. So I think the real question here and the real challenge is to get an agreement on what are the total amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced, what is our yearly goal to reduce them, what is each sector's contribution. And unless you have a measurable goal, unless you have auditing and in a way that you can enforce your goal, it is not only rhetoric, it is obfuscation, and it's really dissembling. And it's hard to know, if anything at all was gained at the G8 when President Bush said, okay, now we're going to do something. We're committed to coming out with some non-binding goals. He is getting, in effect, caught up in this whole global warming discussion. But he's coming kicking and screaming, and it's going to take the Congress, and it's going to take the states, and it's going to take a lot of grassroots organization to move the ball forward. We are fighting a political battle here. It is financed in great measure by automobile companies. They have sued the little state of Vermont. They overwhelm them with the highest paid lawyers in America. And why was Vermont sued? Because they dared adopt the California standards. The automobile companies aren't waiting for the EPA to grant a waiver. They're already trying to destroy the standards through litigation. We are facing a lawsuit in Fresno, California on the same topic. Rhode Island is being sued because they have dared to adopt the standards. Every state that adopts the California standards, and there are now 12 of them, will be sued we'll have to face millions of dollars of legal onslaught paid for by General Motors and the other members of the Automobile Alliance. But not content with their lawsuits and their over-lawyering this issue, they have now gone to the Commerce Committee and they're pushing a legislative short-circuiting of the legal process. That's really incredible for such a proud industry. Now, I want to go to the heart of the matter here, because we heard the woman from NHTSA talk about it, and they invoke the talisman of consumer choice. Consumers 20 years ago didn't know that they needed SUVs and minivans. Only 10% of the cars sold. Now, as she acknowledged, it's 50%. That's just sovereign consumer choice. Not exactly. This is massive propaganda and manipulation in the form of advertising to promote a certain profile of automobile that suits a certain profit profile. And I understand that's good old American economy, it's the market system, and that's fine from that point of view. But unless this Congress can curb that choice, just like we do in other areas, we don't have unlimited choice about everything we do. We have social and moral restraints. When we see the danger of climate change and the disruption that's going to happen to our lives, the rapid snow melt in California, which will destroy our levees, impede our agriculture, the increase in ozone that will affect children's lungs and respiratory disease in the elderly, the erosion of our beaches. This is real stuff. Not to mention, the elimination of low-lying countries like a good part of Bangladesh and other islands in the Pacific. This is serious stuff here. And in order for that, for us to do anything, we're going to have restraints. We're going to have rules. That's what Congress is all about. And I think we have to recognize that it is going to take some changes. Technology is very important, but it's not the only thing. Technology has a number of choices. We have different vehicles, different engines, but also different fuels. And whatever we can do to that, we have to do it. There's three things that are obvious. One, we have to reduce carbon in our fuels. We have to reduce fossil fuel consumption by efficiency, by technological invention. Number two, we need renewable energies. And number three, we have to be able to sequester and cap, or not cap, but prevent carbon from getting into the atmosphere from the burning of coal. It may not be here today, but it's worth spending billions of dollars because we have to get there. You have to do all three, and you have to do all three to the maximum degree as fast as you can. And what you saw today was, I suppose, two good administrators. I don't want to say bureaucrat, but they are good people, and they're doing what they're told to do, or I suppose they'll be fired, just like the U.S. attorneys. I do think that there's some responsibility on the part of the administrator to follow the law, not what George Bush tells him, not what Cheney may say, not a little message from a White House staffer. I do think there is a legal requirement to follow the law. If they follow the law, California will get a waiver. The EPA will promulgate regulations to control greenhouse gases across a broad front. So just in conclusion, I'd say this is not easy stuff. It's going to be tough. If he gives us a waiver, and when I read this testimony, it looks like he is in total stall mode under orders of the president. If that's true, we will sue him. Governor Schwarzenegger has already announced that. I'm his lawyer. We'll be there the first day we can, but of course they can stall. Even if he gives the waiver, the automobile companies are suing us. So it is going to take a couple of years to get this done, and ultimately it's up to you. We need Congress to settle this problem. But in the meantime, we have to do everything we can to get our waiver in California, to get other states to adopt it, to get the fuels, to get the cars, and to do the job across the whole sector. We're committed, and I'm committed to every legal, political, and consumer activist initiative to get this job done. And I just want the automobile companies to know that there's a price to be paid for their sabotage of the California waiver. California is the biggest automobile market, and I would just hope that the President of General Motors and other companies who refuse to meet with me are listening, because I take this very, very seriously, and I'm not going to lay down on this. I'm going to fight with every political and legal strategy that I can envision during the next several years, where I still have enough energy to go at them. But they have an adversary, and we have been at this thing. When I was governor, we had the same cast of characters fighting this when we wanted to reduce emissions on oxides of nitrogen and other technology, and the catalytic converter. It's the same cast, it's the same problems, it's the same money. And we in California have even more resources now, and we're going to go at it. It's no longer just Democrats. We have Republican governors in Connecticut and California. I think we have other Republican governors around with Democrats. So it isn't a party thing. The Democrats are split in Congress. The Republicans hopefully will make up for the defecting Democrats. And together, we're going to take this country back from Cheney's oil mentality and Bush's, Texas short-sighted mismanagement of so many things that we're now suffering from. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor, very much. And I think that when it comes to your political energy, if there ever was such a thing as a renewable energy source, you're it. I don't think anyone's worried about you running out of energy battle on this issue. Now we turn to our other Attorney General, the Attorney General from the state of Massachusetts, my own Attorney General. She has had an incredibly distinguished career. Then the District Attorney of Middlesex County, the largest county in New England, one of the largest counties in the United States. She lives in Medford, Massachusetts, which is where my professional office is. But most significantly, the case Massachusetts versus EPA, the most important environmental decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court of the United States, was won by Massachusetts. And Attorney General Coakley here today is obviously a central player in this whole debate globally over whether or not we're going to deal with this issue. It's our honor to have you with us today, Attorney General Coakley, and look forward to your testimony. Turn on the microphone, please.
Is that better? Yes. Thank you, Chairman Markey and Congressman Blumenauer. And General Brown, Massachusetts will be right with you in that battle, as many of the states will, around this particular issue. I appreciate the invitation for General Brown and I to talk to you today. I have submitted written testimony. I'm going to be brief this morning, but would ask that the committee accept the written testimony as part of this hearing. And I cannot resist a very brief...
Without objection, that will be included in the record.
Thank you. I cannot resist a brief fish story around the global warming issue. I recall I had the great good fortune in the summer of 1974 to work for Congressman Silvio Conti, who is from western Massachusetts, where I grew up, and one of his big issues was cleaning up the Connecticut River, getting rid of the PCBs, bringing salmon back to the Connecticut River, and he was successful in doing that. That was a good result, salmon in the Connecticut River. I read, Congressman Markey, that after your trip to Cannon Mountain to look at some of the effects in New England of global warming, that the local fishermen off New Hampshire and Maine indicated that for the first time they were seeing bluefish. They had never seen them north of Cape Cod. A very tangible result, a true fish story, but not a good one, and a harbinger of what we are facing. As the Supreme Court recognized this past April, states are and will be directly harmed by climate change. Particularly in Massachusetts, we are losing 200 miles of coastline to rising seas. States across the country are concerned about threats to water supply, the increase in severe weather events that are costing all of us. General Brown mentioned some of the effects in California. This Commonwealth, Massachusetts, recognizes global warming needs immediate attention. In fact, it needs it yesterday. To this end, we are engaged in Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a market-based cap and trade program for power plant emissions. We are committed to investing in renewable energy and are leading with proposals for green public buildings and expansion of public transportation. Meanwhile, we've been waiting and eager for the federal government to take a leadership role in our necessary fight against global warming. One of the committee members earlier indicated that the federal government should lead, follow, or get out of the way. It is a huge issue on this particular issue, as I might note it is on others, whether it's consumer protection, submortgage lending. The federal government has frankly been a huge disappointment in this issue. We have been long waiting for the Environmental Protection Agency to adopt motor vehicle emission standards that would allow states to address the leading cause of global warming. Given the decision in Massachusetts versus EPA and Congressman Markey's opening remarks, I won't belabor the history of the case, but it is important to note that the United States has been for a long time, since 1992, part of the Rio Treaty, and it commits the United States and other developed countries to reduce emissions and presumably to take leadership in that. Congressman Markey outlined the history where, frankly, not much happened, particularly recently in environmental groups filing the rulemaking petition in 1999. That was the basis of the suit that Massachusetts was lead counsel for, and I think it's ironic that in this day and age, Massachusetts and other states have had to file a lawsuit to demonstrate to the Environmental Protection Agency that its job actually includes protecting the environment. Simply put, the EPA cannot plausibly say that the statutory trigger for commencing regulation, that emissions are endangering public health and welfare, has not been met. They refuse to do that today. It still flies in the face of common sense and all the evidence that they see before them. We are heartened, I will say, that the White House and EPA appear to acknowledge this in their characterizations of the impact of the court's ruling and in their promises that regulations controlling greenhouse gas emissions will be forthcoming. However, we are disheartened, as I believe we were today, that the EPA has stressed the need for lengthy periods of time, both to digest the Supreme Court decision, and I would note that the Supreme Court decision is not that complicated. It's pretty straightforward in what it decides in terms of standing, the authority of the EPA, and their need to articulate some reason why they can't issue these regulations. They have indicated that they need to embark on a period of exhausted deliberation with other agencies about what to do next. We are also discouraged by the EPA's reluctance to commit to firm proposals or any timelines for action. If they're serious about attacking the problem of global climate change, then there are two specific things that they should pursue immediately. They should begin immediately a formal process to conclude that endangerment threshold has been crossed. Starting that process is simple. It requires no further deliberation on their part. They need merely to publish a notice in the Federal Register and that they propose to determine that these emissions contribute to air pollution which may be reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. By beginning the process now, the EPA does not forfeit any right to deliberate over more difficult regulatory design issues involved in actually setting the applicable emission standards. However, a continued unwillingness even to start that process says that their promises about being concerned about global warming are illusory only. Secondly, once that public comment process concludes next week, the EPA should grant California's request for a Section 209 waiver for state motor vehicle regulation as expediently as possible. I want to emphasize, as General Brown did, how important the EPA's approval of the waiver is for the dozen states, including the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that have adopted those California regulations. While California has notified the EPA it will sue if they don't rule on the waiver by October, there is simply no reason for the EPA to wait that long. They should decide it more quickly. They should give a timeline on when they're going to decide. And I frankly think that General Brown and I speak for our colleagues when we say we'd like nothing better than to see any further litigation by state attorneys general on this issue obviated. We do have other things to do as attorneys general than to bring to the attention of the federal government that it's not doing its job. And so that is an important issue, I know, for California and for all of us who say lead, follow, or get out of the way, because they can't have it every way. You know, the Supreme Court ruling has induced many industry groups to call for a more comprehensive and a market-based approach to replace the sector-by-sector command and control regulation under the Clean Air Act. We welcome in Massachusetts the engagement of the affected industries in the legislative debates, and we hope that they will work to help produce an efficacious result. And we emphasize that while Congress can improve upon the regulatory approaches that the Clean Air Act provides, we are very firm in believing that the current law allows the EPA to immediately go a long way to addressing the problem now. As Congress considers additional legislative approaches, we urge it to reject the language that Congressman Butcher, Chairman of Energy and Air Quality Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, unveiled last Friday and held a hearing on yesterday. I addressed that more at length in my written testimony. It would be taking a step backward to proceed with that legislation. And while individual states continue to work or lessen environmental impact, Congress could take a major step in the right direction by passing legislation to significantly increase our fuel economy standards without hampering states' emission efforts or marginalizing the EPA's authority, helping both our environment and consumers' wallets. We specifically urge Congress to respect and support the role of states in developing solutions. We need to find creative ways to structure such a program that allows for states to continue to play a leadership role without placing excessive burdens on local industries. And we suggest, for example, if a national cap-and-trade emission trading program were enacted, emission credits could be distributed on a state-by-state basis, allowing each state to set aside additional reductions should they so choose. I want to thank you again for allowing us this opportunity both to submit written testimony and orally today. We appreciate in Massachusetts the critical work that you are undertaking, not just for our nation, but for our planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for your testimony. Attorney General Coakley, let me ask you this question. You referred to the hearing which this Select Committee on Global Warming had earlier this week up at Cannon Mountain in
Yes.
New Hampshire. We heard testimony there at Cannon Mountain that the temperature in New England in the winter has actually warmed up 4.4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. We were told by scientists that the weather in Boston now in the winter is the weather that Philadelphia had in 1970. If this pace of warming increases, that we will continue to go down the eastern seaboard of the United States trying to find a comparable city. And that perhaps in the future we will have to rename the White Mountains the mountains formerly called the White Mountains, because there will be no snow. Now, in your case that you brought, Massachusetts versus EPA, could you lay out the danger to Massachusetts which you made to the Supreme Court, and why it not only affects Massachusetts but other states in our...
Well, as you know, it was a huge issue on the standing issue alone as to whether or not Massachusetts had suffered harm or could show harm. And the principal facts that we pointed to were what I indicated earlier about the coastline of Massachusetts, that because of the rise in ocean temperature and the receding coastline, we have actually lost 200 miles of coastline. We anticipate that that will continue if this problem is not abated in a way that creates additional issues, obviously, as General Brown indicated, around storms, weather disasters, contamination of water supplies. I mean, it's not by accident, I guess, that the two states on the coast will feel these effects earliest already and probably be damaged the most, but they will affect everybody in this country as those effects continue to mount. And the concerning thing is, and I think, again, for this Supreme Court to recognize that Massachusetts was correct, that the Bush administration was not doing its job, I think speaks for itself. Their acknowledgement that we had met the standing by the actual danger and the anticipated danger supported by scientific documentation indicated, I think, the real danger that we face now. But more importantly, if we do not start this process, we can expect it to continue unabated. And your questions to the EPA about rates of how are we going to bring these greenhouse emission rates down clearly does not indicate a timetable that begins to address in an effective and safe way the issues that we are facing now because of global warming.
Now, were you surprised when Administrator Johnson on May 14th in his press conference announced that he was looking to Justice Scalia's dissent in Massachusetts versus EPA as the standard that he was going to use as to how the EPA would proceed?
Well, when you lose a case, I know as a lawyer, you often look to the dissent for some comfort, but it's not the law of the land. And it is discouraging to see again the failure to acknowledge, even after all of these years and even after the Supreme Court has spoken, that they don't have a timetable, they don't have a way to proceed in a quick and efficacious way, which calls into question what they really want to accomplish. I think there's no other conclusion that you can draw, not only before the lawsuit, but after the lawsuit. And that's why this hearing today is so important, because they need to be held to standards that will allow them to proceed to protect the environment and allow us to proceed in ways, as General Brown outlined. We've already begun to be effective in controlling these greenhouse emissions.
Now, Attorney General Brown, there is, as has been noted, a piece of draft legislation that has now been introduced. And there's a debate over whether or not language in that draft legislation would in fact prohibit the EPA administrator, Mr. Johnson, from giving California the ability to be able to regulate CO2 emissions from tailpipes. The proponents of the legislation say that it would not prohibit it. Can you give us your reading of that draft legislation and what the implications are for your ability to protect the citizens of your state?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Chairman Dingell wrote a letter to the Attorney Generals and admitted that the draft would eliminate EPA's ability to grant a waiver to California to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from cars. So that's right in his letter. And I believe that he also said that EPA couldn't regulate greenhouse gases when with respect to cars. So he wants to put it over in NHTSA. That's where he wants to situate it, and that is a very different set of standards because, as you mentioned earlier, it's not dealing with health, it's not dealing with emissions, it's dealing with fuel efficiency, safety, and feasibility, and the well-being of the industry. So those are totally different standards. So it's very clear here that the Congress has to deal with the fact, are you going to let, well, we have it's Bush won't do it, he won't let his EPA do it, and there's a movement in Congress. And if we just focus on auto emissions, it's coming from the Auto Alliance, which has a plan to sabotage any efforts to impose restraints on them. You can't sugarcoat it any other way. And so there we are. Ultimately it's going to take Congress to clarify and to get a national standard. In the meantime, though, it might be easiest to get a California standard because it looks like EPA is moving in a much more circuitous route. I think they're taking deliberate speed to heart. And deliberate speed doesn't mean fast. It means decades of failure to act. That's what it meant in the civil rights area, and it certainly seems to be the same word that they're invoking, that he's invoking in this particular area.
Well, let me go back to you, Attorney General Coakley, when it comes to Massachusetts versus EPA. There is similar language in this proposed legislation, which could potentially strip the EPA of the authority which was given to it as part of your victory in Massachusetts versus EPA. But those who are propounding this legislation say that is not so. Can you give us your reading of what this legislation would do to the victory Massachusetts won at the Supreme Court?
Yeah, no, I agree with General Brown on that matter, and my staff, including Assistant Attorney General Jim Milkey, who, by the way, made the argument before the Supreme Court very effectively, and convince them, particularly on standing issues, that legislation would strip the EPA effectively of the ability to regulate it. And I think the committee has clearly noted, and General Brown has noted, that although they may have parallel tracks, NHTSA and EPA have very different hats to wear in mandates, and they may be at odds in trying to promote fuel efficiency standards, for instance, coal to liquids or other issues that do not provide for the concern that we have, which is the protection of the EPA. We believe that they're not inconsistent results, and they should go hand in hand, but this is not an administration that seems to feel that way. And their response to saying we don't want agencies with overlapping responsibility is to file this bill that would then take it away from the EPA. That's the completely wrong response. If there's overlapping responsibility, then so be it. Let those agencies work it out, or let Congress decide. But don't take it away from the agency that has as its mandate the need to protect the environment. It's a clear end run around, and I think General Brown is right in terms of what is going on here.
Did you agree, is your reading the same as Attorney General Coakley's, Mr. Brown, that Massachusetts versus EPA is vitiated in that legislation?
To the extent that it yes, I want to limit my focus to the automobile area, but that's clearly the goal of that draft legislation, is to transfer from the EPA to the Transportation Department the responsibility to deal with efficiency. And there's no conflict. As Massachusetts Attorney General just said, the EPA is regulating emissions of greenhouse gases. The NHTSA is dealing with automobile efficiency. But even there, we have to be honest about it, that we're suing NHTSA. They're in court too. I was in court 2 months ago in the Ninth Circuit objecting to their paltry and pathetic 1 mile per gallon increase. And as a matter of fact, our experts are saying it's going to increase fuel consumption because they're privileging cars by weight. So the bigger your car, the less you have to reduce. So they're going in the exact wrong direction, invoking safety in this consumer choice business, but they're not dealing with the fact, and that's why, to cut through all the smoke and the fog, I noticed that the environmental defense in their testimony yesterday had a very simple number. 434 million metric tons of carbon in 2005 came from the U.S. auto sector. Now, there it is. How much of the 434, which is based on the whole cycle from beginning to end, are they going to cut? Is it going to be 432 next year? Is it going up? Is it going down? By how much? So the big thing I think you have to watch out is the squid process, where they emit all this ink to block any kind of assault on their status quo effort. And so I want to just know, 434, when does it go down? That's all we got to know. And then what are the means to get it down? What does it cost? What does it take? And I even said, hey, if the automobile companies need some money because they're so mismanaged, I think you ought to give them a few billion. Because I think it's more important to cut greenhouse gases than it is to fight with these automobile companies. If they need a handout, they should own up to the fact they can't do it without a handout. They can line up like everybody else who is needy and has various issues, and we'll help them. But the main thing is take that 434 million metric tons and get it down as soon as you can in the most intelligent, market-based way that you can. That's what cap and trade is about. And by the way, I just want to mention the other thing, oil dependency, 9 million barrels a day, 9 million barrels a day. On a carbon content basis, 65% is imported. 65%, if you take the carbon content of the petroleum that we're using, comes from foreign countries. 9 million, that's pretty bad. So how do we get that down? How do we save Americans, consumers money? And how do we get that the carbon out of it? That's simple. They don't give you a measure. If they don't give you a mechanism to enforce it, it is baloney. That's the way, I think it's that simple, and I think the biggest enemy here is complexity and obfuscation, and we just got to get it simple, simple, simple. How many grams are you taking out of the atmosphere? If you're not going to talk that language, then it's worthless. In fact, it's worse than worthless because he feels like he's doing something good. He should not sleep at night, the guy who's here.
And Congressman Markey, you keyed into why it is so important. Although Massachusetts versus EPA is technically about motor vehicles, the reason why it has broader implications for that, and the reason why it's so important for them to make the determination that CO2 is dangerous, do that endangerment process, is because if that's done, then they can't say, well, no, this should be handled by the transportation, by NHTSA. It really is an issue around environmental protection, not just fuel economy. And we have to make sure we keep our eye on that ball and not let them play a shell game with these issues.
I agree. I thank both of you. And I would just add this in parenthetically that, and I think it's important for people to know this, that the United States only has 3% of the oil reserves in the world. OPEC has 70% of the oil reserves in the world. We already import 60% of our oil from countries we should not be importing it from. Much of that money is used to then support Al-Qaeda and other efforts that we then have to increase our defense budget to protect against. That's our weakness, having only 3% of the oil resources. But we are a technological giant. That is our strength. And if the EPA and if NHTSA would propound the regulations that would unleash this technological revolution, then we would be using our strength against OPEC and to solve this problem of global warming. But until they're willing to recognize the danger that we're under and the solution, we have big problems. Let me now turn and recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I found the hearing today to be very, very useful. I deeply appreciate our witnesses joining to sort of book in the other side of the equation with what I agree with Mr. Brown was sort of an embarrassing presentation. I really do deeply concerned about EPA as an institution, the hundreds of dedicated men and women that I've met with that work there who have a mission to protect the health, to protect the environment. What I would like, I just have one question that I would pose to each of you. Imagine for a moment that we had an administration and an administrator that was focused on complying with the decision and its mandate to protect public health. That has been presumably having smart people looking at this since 2005. I understand California has had experience with waivers granted by EPA dozens of times. I don't think any one of them was ever rejected. If we get back in the mindset that they're going to comply with the law and they're going to protect public health and the environment, how fast could this be accomplished? I wonder if both of you would comment on how fast, how it would be done in an ideal world if their commitment was protecting the environment, complying with the law.
I'll take a stab at that, General Brown. As I indicated earlier, and my folks informed me, they should have begun right after Massachusetts versus EPA, the determination of the endangerment process, and from that begin to establish the regulations that they feel are appropriate once they made that finding. Whether that takes 6 months or 8 months, I'm not sure, but they could do it at least that quickly, it seems to me, because they've been working on these issues and they have before them. But these
and they have the body of all the evidence and research and work that went into the crafting of the California.
Exactly. And so they have the endangerment finding threshold, they have hearings, and then they issue the regulations. But while they're doing that, they also can grant California the waiver so that the processes are proceeding immediately in parallel to allow the states to set the way in which we can proceed and in a way that doesn't interfere, I think, with industry trade, and work at the federal and state level to start this process, as I said yesterday. The very concerning thing is all this talk about the need to deliberate and it's complicated and whatever. It if they wanted to do it, they could do it ASAP, I believe.
Well, California has a goal of 30% reduction in auto emission greenhouse gases by 2016, and that process is complete. The regulations are ready to go as soon as EPA gives us the green light. In terms of overall greenhouse gas reduction, we have a goal of 25%. Now, those regulations have not been finished, and that will take another year or two to get done. But we're on track. And I don't want to minimize that this is something easy. I think it is difficult. I think the European countries have had a difficult time. All the Japan, Germany, France, England, they've all had a tough time. So I think what really has to happen is that we get a cooperative spirit to reduce to the maximum degree that's truly feasible. And I don't think we have that commitment. It's really a stall to allow companies, in this case the auto companies, to make as much money as they can because they are having a tough time. They're losing money. They're cutting jobs. I'm very sympathetic with that. So I think we have to get into but they got to fight this. This is for them. They're not going to stop. And that pressure then feeds into your deliberations and into the EPA and into the Bush administration. And there's where it is. So I think we have to do the best job we can, get a scientific and technological and market consensus, and try to go. Right now, it's a blockage. It's obfuscation. You don't want liquid from coal. That's not going to work. You don't want paltry CAFE standards like NHTSA has adopted for light trucks. I mean, we need a top-to-bottom, honest discussion about what can be done, and then just be practical about it. I'm not saying be unrealistic, but I don't think we're even there yet. I think what is now is this stall, kind of smoke and mirrors kind of thing, and that prevents doing what we could do, which, when we get that clarity, it'll still be hard. And that's why I think we got to get first to the point, what's the amount that we're emitting, what's a goal that we can reduce, and what are the sector-by-sector game plans in order to get there. And I'm very concerned that it's going to be a couple of years before we even get to agreeing on what the game plan is. Right now it looks like we're just going to have trench warfare for the next couple of years, and that's very unfortunate.
Well, I'm confident the work that Mr. Markey is guiding with this committee that we can mark more rapid progress. The leadership of Speaker Pelosi, I think, is intensely focused on moving us forward. But the work that you are doing, I think, can help provide a framework. And I think I understand how it can be moved forward. I would hope that we could work with you, your staff, and our staff to be able to have a clear, simple explanation of how this could, dare I use the term, fast-tracked. Fast-tracked administratively, or if something needs to happen legislatively, to make sure that you're not in limbo, you're able to move forward. And speaking as one of the residents of one of the states that is part of this coalition with you, we all have a stake in your success. So if you could help us frame that with more precision, I think it would be very helpful for us to be able to support your efforts.
We can do that.
I will. We have some very good scientists, technology people, lawyers in California working on these very issues. When I go back today, I'm going to do exactly what you're saying. I will give you a blueprint for what you should do, and we have the capability to do that. We'll write it up, and we'll get it to you as soon as we can. It'll be thoughtful, it'll be practical, it'll be honest, and then maybe you can share it with our Environmental Protection Administrator.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman.
I really, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have any questions. I want to express, well, first of all, I apologize for having to leave. I'm actually running between two committee hearings right now.
No.
Yes, I'm back here now. Thank you. Are you interested, General Brown, in becoming the EPA administrator?
No, because I like my independent role.
That's a powerful statement you just made. I appreciate this. I hope that we can, as I heard you saying, take use of your commitment and energy in this area to deal with this growing problem. As a former mayor, you know that this is the number one issue of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. They set their priorities for this year, and climate change, dealing with this issue on a local level, is their priority. They will be dealing with this when they're in their summer meeting in Los Angeles, and then we've been asked to come to a field hearing later in Seattle. So I think there are people all around the country. There is some cause for optimism, not from my perspective, listening to what we heard earlier, but certainly from when you look at the mayors, and as you know, the U.S. Conference of Mayors is a bipartisan group, and they voted unanimously to name climate change as the number one issue. And so I'm to some degree optimistic that the government may not lead the way, but I think the people are far ahead of the government, and this government, and that the people are going to push us and push some sections of our government into action. So I thank you, both of you, for coming, and apologize for not having been here.
Great. Well, let's then sum up. Let's let each of the attorneys general who are with us give us their 2-minute summations to the jury here in terms of what they believe that Congress should do with the pending legislation before us, and what their recommendations. So we began with Attorney General Brown, so let's begin the final statements with you, Attorney General Coakley.
Well, my summation may not be all that different from what we argued before the Supreme Court in Massachusetts versus EPA, which is this administration has the authority and now the obligation to issue regulations around motor vehicle emissions, and unless they can and will do that immediately, Congress has to take action. The draft discussion pending, we believe, is counterproductive and takes us backwards. So we are not in favor of that bill. And we would suggest further that what's very important for us at the state level is to allow, as California has led the way, to obtain those waivers so we can proceed to do what we are doing and work collaboratively with Congress and whatever legislation it feels appropriate. And I believe that can be done in a way that gives industry a predictability that can involve them, in fact, in a way that lets them feel that they won't be done sector by sector, but that everybody has an interest, whether they're in government, they're in private practice, whether they're involved in Washington, has an interest in making sure that we address this problem. And it is too serious and it's too important. And it's not speculative. It's a real issue that we need to start to address today. And we look forward to working with you and your staff on this committee and providing what guidance we can.
Thank you very much. Attorney General Brown.
I believe the most important point is to recognize the seriousness of climate disruption. That although there's always uncertainty in scientific modeling and evidence, the risk is so catastrophic. There is a risk, rather, of catastrophe. And that risk is not 2% or 5%. It's a substantial risk. And insurance against that is really what we're asking. And I would say in the tenor of this administration's remarks, there seems to be no recognition of the magnitude of the threat that we're facing. And therefore their response is appropriately tepid for their non-recognition of what it is that we're facing. So that recognition has to be the first thing. Number two, in dealing with global warming, we, of necessity, reduce our dependency on foreign oil. And that is something that every American feels very strongly about, and we have to keep front and center. And then thirdly, I believe protecting the EPA's authority, and that authority, of course, includes the waiver potential for California, and if necessary, to block bad legislation. Do no harm, I would say, has to be the first objective, and then, as circumstances permit, get some positive legislation. But it may not be possible in the next 18 months. It may take longer. I mean, President Bush thinks it takes 18 months to get his own agencies to come up with a plan. It wouldn't be surprising if it took Congress longer than that, because there's more divergency there. But whatever, I think it's pretty clear what has to happen. The Massachusetts won a great victory. That victory has to be protected. It cannot be end run or sabotaged without great harm. So I think our goal, what has to be done, is clear. And the final point I'd make is we need to state this problem in clear numerical measures of carbon, and how much carbon are we taking out each year. That's the goal, and that should be able to be spoken in a matter of a few words. And so everybody knows what the goal is, everybody knows where we are. That's the report card. And I think it speaks volumes that the administrator and the representative of NHTSA did not speak in a measurable report card-like way. Measure us if you see this. Now, it was lots of different points. So I think it has to be simplified by metric tons of carbon linked with reducing oil dependency. That to me is where we have to go, and then do as best we can given the technology and the costs that are entailed.
We thank both of you for your eloquent testimony, but for your vigorous protection of the laws of your states and actually of the country, because you're fighting to give the EPA the authority which it needs in order to protect our country. Just so we're clear here, Massachusetts versus EPA protects California and the other 48 states. But similarly, the California statute, which you are here to testify to protect Attorney General Brown, has been adopted by Massachusetts and 11 or 12 other states. So this effort coming out of the states is what is now applying the pressure to the Bush administration. But it's also coming from the mayors. It's coming from the universities. And it's coming from individuals all across our country. And similarly coming from the United Nations and their reports on global warming and the threat to our planet, but to the United States and its citizens as well. Speaker Pelosi, in our trip as a select committee on global warming 10 days ago, visited Greenland and its ice cap, which is the epicenter of the threat to the planet. We were 0.7 of a mile high block of ice on this ice cap, hundreds of miles long and wide. And it was 5 or 6 Empire State Buildings high, a block of ice. It's melting, it's moving towards the sea. If it does that, ultimately, it would lead to a 20-foot increase in the sea level of the world. Speaker Pelosi was told by those in Greenland that she was the highest-ranking American public official to ever visit Greenland. What a shame our EPA administrator has yet to visit. And she has made it quite clear that she is not going to allow for interference in California law or law which will give the EPA the ability to be able to act on these issues. But it's your efforts at the state level that has created now this conflict with the Bush administration, and Massachusetts and California have been in the lead, and we thank you for that. The two individuals here are the living embodiment of this effort. We thank you for your efforts. This hearing is adjourned.
Very nice to see you. Okay. Okay, good.
Thank you very much, sir.